Sometimes I sit here on this old porch swing, watching the Spanish moss sway from the oaks like time itself, and I wonder if the past ever really stays behind us. The breeze in Savannah carries memories like the scent of jasmine in the summer. Soft, sweet, and just a little bit heavy. Hello, dears. My name is Clara Mayfield, and I'm 74 years old. I live in a little yellow house on the corner of Walnut and Maple, where I've been for over 4 decades now. To the folks who pass by, I might look like just another old woman with too many cats and a garden full of stubborn marigolds. But behind these wrinkles and quiet hands is a lifetime. A long winding road paved with heartbreak, hope, and a whole lot of lessons no one asked to learn. If you're watching this, whether from a bustling apartment in Chicago, a quiet farmhouse in Kansas, or your phone late at night when sleep won't come, I want to thank you. Thank you for giving an old woman a few moments of your time. I don't have fancy lights or filters or a big production crew. Just my words, my memories, and maybe a slice of apple pie cooling on the windowsill. They say when you get old you forget things, but I think it's the opposite. I think you remember everything. Even the things you wish you could forget. Especially those. I wasn't always Clara Mayfield. I was once Clara Jane Patterson, a little barefoot girl running through the hot Georgia dirt roads, chasing lightning bugs and daydreams, long before I understood what sorrow really meant. I grew up in the 1950s in a town so small it barely made the map, Whistle Bend, just 40 minutes outside of Savannah. It was the kind of place where the church bell rang twice on Sunday, where gossip traveled faster than the mail, and where everybody knew your name and your business. My mama Eloise was the strongest woman I've ever known. She raised me on her own after my daddy died in a mill accident when I was 4. She worked as a seamstress from sunup to sundown, fingers raw from thread and needle, always humming some hymn under her breath while stitching life back together one seam at a time. She taught me early that strength didn't come from yelling, but from keeping your head high when your heart's breaking inside. I used to sit on a stool beside her work table, pretending to sew doll clothes while she pieced together dresses from scraps. We didn't have much. Not money, not security, not even certainty about where our next meal would come from sometimes, but we had each other. And for a long while that felt like enough. But I was a dreamer. Always was. I used to imagine that one day, a man would ride up to our little house on a red motorcycle, sweep mama off her feet, and give us a better life. Or that I'd grow up and become a teacher in some big city, wearing high heels and perfume and reading poetry aloud to quiet classrooms. Life as it does had other plans. There are parts of this story that will be hard. I won't sugarcoat them, but I promise there's light too. Love. Laughter. There were moments that nearly broke me, and some that stitched me back together, just like Mama's patchwork quilts. I'm telling this now because I think maybe someone out there needs to hear it. Maybe you need to know that survival isn't about never falling. It's about learning how to rise again, even when your bones ache and your voice trembles. Especially then. Over the next hour or so, I'm going to tell you everything. Not just the pretty pieces but the broken ones too. The secrets that were whispered behind closed doors. The nights I didn't think I'd make it. And the people who helped me believe again in love, in justice, in myself. And before we begin, I'd like to ask you something. If this story touches your heart, if it reminds you of someone you've loved, lost, or had to let go, please leave a comment and tell me about them. Tell me where you're watching from. It helps me feel less alone in these memories. And if you find something in my story that feels familiar, that makes you feel seen or understood, I hope you carry that feeling with you, long after the final words. Now, would you mind pouring yourself a cup of tea? Or maybe coffee if that's your thing. Sit back, get comfortable. This won't be a fairy tale, but it will be true. And sometimes truth is what saves us. Welcome to my story. Welcome to the porch. They say every quilt tells a story. Mama used to say that often as she pieced together scraps of fabric from old dresses, tablecloths, baby clothes, and church handkerchiefs. Each square, she said, held a memory. A birthday, a loss, a moment that meant something, even if no one ever spoke it aloud. That's how it was in our house growing up. We didn't speak the heavy things aloud. I must have been 6 when I first noticed how silence worked like a second language in our little home in Whistle Bend. Mama was a master of it. She could say everything with the look in her eyes or the way her hands trembled just a bit more than usual while stirring cornbread batter. Our house had 3 rooms. One bedroom, a kitchen, and a front room with a pull-out sofa. It was neat, spotless even, but poor. The kind of poor where you reuse coffee grounds and save bacon grease in a tin for flavoring beans. But Mama always made it feel dignified. Like home. Like ours. She had a Singer sewing machine that sat by the window, and next to it, a worn wooden stool where I spent most afternoons. I loved to sort her buttons, hundreds of them in a glass mason jar. Red ones, ivory ones, little pearly ones that looked like moonlight. While she sewed, I'd ask endless questions. Mama, why do we never visit Daddy's side of the family? Mama, why don't we go to the Johnsons' church anymore? Mama, how come you never cry? She'd answer the same way every time, with a soft, patient quiet. Some stories, Clara, just aren't meant to be told yet. And that one-word promise, it stayed with me. Sometimes hope. Sometimes heartbreak. I learned early that being a good girl meant not pushing too hard. That emotions, especially big ones like anger, confusion, or grief, were things you folded neatly and tucked away in the back of your heart, like an old quilt in the cedar chest. For safekeeping. For silence. One time in 2nd grade I came home crying. A boy at school had called me fatherless and said my dress looked like a curtain. I told Mama, expecting her to storm up to the school or at least hold me tight. But instead, she knelt down and smoothed my hair behind my ear. People will always find something cruel to say, my flower. What matters is whether you let their words shape who you become. Then she handed me her needle and said, "Come stitch with me a while." And I did. I learned to pull the thread tight but not too tight, just enough to hold things together without tearing the fabric. That was Mama's way of teaching me how to survive. Looking back, I realize Mama was doing the best she could with what little she had. Her own mother died in childbirth, and her father, a harsh man who believed women belonged in silence, raised her with more rules than affection. She never learned how to say "I'm scared" or "I'm lonely," or even "I'm proud of you." But she showed it in other ways. The way she double-checked my school lunch every morning, the way she taught me to hem my own skirts, the way she turned down extra work if I had a recital or spelling bee. She made a life out of nothing but thread, scraps, and willpower. And somehow she made sure I had more than she ever did. But even so, something in me always longed for more than the unspoken. I wanted words. I wanted understanding. I wanted to hear out loud that my father had mattered. That his loss had broken her. That she cried for him in the middle of the night like I did. But she never did. There was one night, though, that broke the pattern. I was 9 and I couldn't sleep. The summer heat was thick, and I heard her in the front room, rocking, humming softly and tenderly. I crept out, and there she was holding one of her quilts against her chest like it was a person. Her face was wet with tears, but she didn't hide them this time. "Mama," I whispered. "Why are you crying?" She looked at me, and for the first time the silence cracked. "Because I miss him, Clara," she said. "I miss your daddy so much. Sometimes I forget how to breathe." Then she patted the seat beside her, and I climbed onto her lap, too big but not yet too big, and we rocked together while the crickets sang outside. That night taught me 2 things. First, that even the strongest women can break. And second, that silence isn't the absence of love. It's often the shape it takes when love hurts too much to speak. Years later, when I became a mother myself, I'd remember that lesson. I'd remember how silence shaped me. How it stitched itself into the very fabric of who I was. But I also knew I wanted to do things differently. I wanted my children to know that in our home we could speak. We could cry. We could rage. And still be safe. But that's a chapter for another day. For now, I'll leave you with this. The quilts we inherit, whether stitched with fabric or silence, carry weight. But they also carry warmth. And in remembering them, in telling the stories tucked between the seams, we reclaim our voice. And sometimes that's where healing begins. I was 16 when Samuel Mayfield first walked into Mama's kitchen, and I swear to this day the air shifted. Maybe it was just the July heat and the scent of honeysuckle outside. Or maybe it was hope, finally stepping across the threshold in the form of a tall, soft-spoken man with a kind smile and calloused hands. I had just come home from the little library in Whistle Bend with a stack of books. Most of them romances I pretended were for the story, but really I was just desperate to believe that love could be real for girls like me. That same afternoon, Mama had taken in a rush order to fix a torn hem on the foreman's wife's Sunday dress. She was working by the window, her glasses slipping down her nose, when the knock came at the screen door. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, hat in his hands. "I'm looking for Miss Eloise Patterson?" "That's me," Mama replied, eyeing him cautiously. "And who might you be?" He introduced himself as Samuel Mayfield, recently hired to work at the new lumber mill being built on the outskirts of town. He'd been told by the pastor that Mama was the best seamstress this side of the Savannah River, and he was hoping she could patch the inside lining of his Sunday coat. "Nothing fancy," he said. "Just something to make it last a little longer." Mama waved him in and asked him to wait at the table while she finished pinning a hem. I sat in the corner pretending to read but really just observing. Samuel didn't speak much, but there was a quiet confidence in how he sat. No twitching. No bravado. He thanked Mama for the cold tea she poured and complimented the roses blooming just outside the kitchen window. After he left, Mama didn't say much, but I noticed the way she folded her sewing with more care than usual. I also noticed she fixed his coat that very night, staying up late, humming an old gospel tune under her breath. When he returned to pick it up, he brought fresh peaches from the farmer's stand and asked, very politely, if he might attend service with us sometime. "He's respectful," Mama murmured after the door shut. "A man who doesn't mind sitting with women in silence. That's rare. Started slow like good things often do. Samuel would walk us home from church. Sometimes he'd stay for supper, offering to fix the leaky faucet or chop firewood without ever being asked. Mama warmed to him quickly. Me? I was a bundle of nerves and butterflies. No boy in town had ever looked at me twice, but Samuel saw me. Not like a child, not like a charity case. Like a girl becoming a woman. I remember the night he brought me a book of poems, Langston Hughes, and said, 'You strike me as someone who feels things deeply, Miss Clara.' My face flushed. No one had ever spoken to me like that. I read that book cover to cover that night, hugging it to my chest like it could anchor me. One Sunday after service, he asked if I'd like to walk with him by the river. Just the two of us. Mama said yes before I could even open my mouth. "You're old enough," she said. "But keep your head and your heart balanced, Clara." We talked about books, about music, about dreams. I told him I wanted to be a teacher, maybe even leave Whistle Bend someday. He told me he'd grown up in Macon, raised by a grandmother who believed hard work was next to godliness. He didn't have much schooling, but he loved to work with his hands, wood mostly. Said one day he wanted to build his own home, with porches on all sides and a rocking chair for every season. "I don't need much," he said. "Just a little land and a good woman to share it with." A few months later, under a sky full of stars and the sound of crickets singing backup, Samuel asked me to marry him. No ring, just a look so steady and sincere I almost cried. "I may not have a fortune, Clara Jane," he said, "but I'll give you a good name, honest work, and love that doesn't shake when the wind blows." I said yes before he finished the sentence. We married that fall, me in a sky blue dress Mama stitched with her best lace, him in that same coat she'd once mended. The church ladies brought pies. Mama wept quietly during the vows. It wasn't a grand wedding, but it was ours. Looking back now, I see how that season of life was wrapped in soft hope, like a quilt just off the line, still smelling of sunshine and starch. It wasn't perfect. Samuel had shadows I didn't yet understand, quiet moments when his mind seemed far away. But I loved him fiercely. I believed in the home we could build together. And for a while that belief was enough. But my dears, love, real love, isn't just about the beginning. It's about what happens when the rain comes, when the job falls through, when the baby doesn't arrive, and the nights grow too quiet. That part of the story, well, it's coming next. But let me pause here on that sweet memory, when I was a girl who said yes to a man who carried hope in his eyes. Before the grief, before the war, before the silence returned. Because even when things fall apart, those soft beginnings matter. They remind us that we once believed in better. And sometimes that's enough to begin again. There's a kind of silence that hangs in the air after loss. It's not like the hush of night or the calm before a storm. It's heavier, dense, like thick fog that slips into your lungs and settles there. That's what our home felt like after the baby didn't come. We had been married just over a year. Samuel and I were still learning the rhythms of each other, who liked the covers tucked in tight, who forgot to put the sugar back in the pantry, who needed space to think, and who needed a hand to hold when words didn't come easy. It was a good time. Not perfect, not always easy, but good. When I missed my period in the spring of 71, I didn't tell him right away. I wanted to be sure. I wanted to protect the moment, keep it small and sacred before the world touched it. I remember the afternoon I finally told him. We were sitting on the porch drinking sweet tea after supper. The honeysuckle vines were just beginning to bloom, and fireflies floated through the dusk like little miracles. "I think we're going to need a crib," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, blinked, and then just like that, his face broke into the softest smile. No wild celebration, no shouting. Just a long exhale and a hand resting gently on my stomach. "We're going to do this, Clara Jane," he said. "We're going to be a family." The weeks that followed were the happiest I had ever known. Samuel built a little wooden cradle in the shed behind the house. It was simple, rocked with just a nudge, but he sanded it until it was as smooth as river stone. He even carved a tiny daisy on the headboard, because I told him once that daisies reminded me of innocence. Mama made tiny blankets from old scraps, and I started collecting names in a little notebook. Anna for a girl, Benjamin for a boy. I dreamed of soft baby hands and middle-of-the-night lullabies. I pictured my belly growing round, Samuel's hand resting there like a promise. But that belly never grew. At first I thought maybe I'd gotten the dates wrong, or that some women just didn't show much until later. I told myself stories, kind ones, hopeful ones. But as the days turned to weeks, my body remained unchanged. No fluttering, no nausea, no swelling. Then the cramps came. Sharp, twisting pains that doubled me over one afternoon while hanging laundry. I collapsed into the dirt, clutching my abdomen, and knew before the blood even came. It was over. But how could something be over if it had never really begun? Samuel found me in the backyard, tears streaking my face, a smear of dust on my apron. He didn't ask questions, just scooped me into his arms and carried me inside. That night, he held me while I wept, loud and messy and raw, until the crying gave way to silence. That old, thick silence I'd known since I was a girl. No doctor had confirmed the pregnancy. We hadn't told the neighbors. There was no death certificate.
No funeral.
But the grief was real, bone deep, and invisible. People don't always know how to comfort a loss they can't see. "Well, at least you can try again," someone said at church a few weeks later, when word finally trickled out. I wanted to scream. Try again. As if babies were recipes you just redo if they don't rise right the first time. Mama didn't say much. But I caught her one morning folding the tiny quilt she'd started, soft blues and yellows, and slipping it into the cedar chest without a word. Her silence said it all. Samuel tried to be strong for both of us. He went back to work the next day, hammering nails and sanding wood like nothing had happened. But he stopped talking about the cradle, stopped carving little toys. And one night I heard him crying softly in the shed, thinking I couldn't hear. Grief settled between us like an unwelcome guest. We tiptoed around it. Some days we talked about everything but the baby. Other days we sat in silence, each waiting for the other to speak first. It took time, months, maybe years, before we found our way back to each other fully. Before we could laugh without guilt. Before we could hold hands without remembering what had almost been. I never got pregnant again. Doctors later used words like secondary infertility and uterine scarring. Cold words that never really softened the truth. There was no baby. There would be no baby. And yet we still had a family. Just the two of us. And though there was always a small ache, like a tender bruise that never quite faded, we learned to live around it. We traveled, sometimes just an hour's drive, to places we'd never seen. We danced in the kitchen to old Motown songs. We hosted nieces and nephews in the summer, and spoiled them with too much sugar and bedtime stories. And we loved. Quietly. Fiercely. So, to anyone watching who knows this kind of grief, the kind that has no photo, no grave, no name, I want to tell you something. Your loss matters. Even if no one else sees it. Even if you never got to hold them. Even if you only whispered their name once, in a notebook you couldn't bring yourself to throw away. Love leaves echoes. And sometimes those echoes become the gentlest parts of us. There are some kinds of war that never make it to the front page. The ones without marching boots or battle flags. The ones that happen behind closed doors. Quiet, creeping wars that settle into the bones of a good man and pull him away piece by piece. That's what happened to Samuel. It didn't begin with a bang. There was no explosion or sudden storm. Just a slow unraveling. At first I thought it was just grief. After the miscarriage, we both became shadows of ourselves. But while I eventually found ways to piece myself back together, through sewing, through small joys, through my faith, Samuel, he started slipping away. He still went to work every day at the mill, still kissed me goodbye each morning and sat beside me at church on Sundays. But the light in his eyes had dimmed, like someone had pulled the curtains in his soul and forgotten to open them again. It was the fall of 1972 when the first letter came. Thick paper. Government seal. A sharp, official fold that made my stomach turn before I even opened it. Samuel had been placed on a list. Selective Service Reserve. Technically, he wasn't being drafted yet, but the war in Vietnam was raging, and they were calling up more and more men by the month. Samuel was 28, healthy with no children. He fit the profile perfectly. I watched his hands shake as he read the letter. He didn't say much. Just folded it carefully, placed it in the kitchen drawer, and went outside to chop wood that didn't need chopping. That night, I heard him pacing the floor long after midnight. When I asked if he wanted to talk, he only said, "Not yet, Clara Jane." Weeks passed. Then months. More letters. More updates from the government. The waiting became a kind of torture. Like standing on the edge of a cliff and never knowing when the wind might blow hard enough to push you over. Samuel changed in quiet ways. He stopped whistling while he worked. He started drinking coffee late at night, as if sleep had become a stranger. He sat on the porch more, staring off into the woods with a look I couldn't quite place. Then came the day he came home with a black eye. I was folding laundry when he walked in, face bruised, lips swollen. "What happened?" I gasped, rushing to him. "It's nothing," he muttered, brushing past me. "Just a man at the bar mouthing off about the war. Called me a coward. But you haven't even been drafted yet." "Doesn't matter," he said, voice low. "They see my name on the list. They think I'm next. They look at me like I've already chosen death. Or worse, like I haven't." I wanted to say something to comfort him, but the words didn't come. What could I say to a man who felt like he was drowning in something invisible? He began talking less and less. Some nights, he didn't come home until long after dark. Others, he sat alone in the shed for hours, not even working, just existing, floating through a fog of fear and confusion. I didn't know how to reach him. I tried. Lord knows I tried. I cooked his favorite meals, read to him from the newspaper, told him about silly things, what the neighbor's dog did, how Miss Lottie down the road dyed her hair bright orange. But he only smiled faintly, like someone watching a play from behind glass. And then one night he finally spoke. We were sitting on the porch. The air was cool, the kind of night that used to make us dream together. But instead he turned to me and said, "Clara, I don't know who I am anymore." I took his hand. "You're my husband. The man who built me a cradle and carved a daisy in it." He looked down at his hands. "But I never got to put a baby in it, did I?" The pain in his voice was sharp. And then the truth spilled out. His guilt over the miscarriage, his fear of the war, the pressure of being a man expected to carry everything and speak of nothing. He said he felt like a ghost in his own life. Like the world had asked too much and left him with too little. That was the night I realized the war had already come for Samuel. He hadn't been drafted yet. He might never go. But in his heart, in his spirit, he was already fighting battles no one else could see. It would take time, years in fact, for me to understand that trauma isn't always about what happens to the body. Sometimes it's what happens before something terrible even begins. The weight of what might happen can break a person just as surely as any battlefield. We sought help eventually, after much convincing. Samuel went to see a pastor who had served in Korea and understood that kind of fear. Slowly, painfully, Samuel began to heal. Not completely, not cleanly, but enough. Enough to smile again. To reach for my hand again. To dream again. But for a while, we lived in that strange limbo. A man preparing for a war he might never fight. A woman trying to hold him together while holding herself too. To anyone out there loving someone who's hurting quietly, you are not invisible. And neither are they. Sometimes the strongest battles are the ones we fight at home. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep showing up. There are some cries that don't sound like pain, they sound like grace. I still remember the first time I heard my daughter cry. A shrill, healthy wail that echoed through the delivery room like the trumpet of angels. After years of praying, grieving, and doubting, I had nearly convinced myself that motherhood would never be mine. But that night, in a small hospital in Pine Creek, I became a mother. For real. For good. Her name was Lily. We chose it because she came into our lives like spring after a bitter winter. Fragile, beautiful, stubbornly blooming where there had once only been cold. Samuel held her in trembling hands, eyes wide with disbelief. "She's real," he whispered. "She's really here." And in that moment, something melted inside him. The shadow that had lingered for so long. The weight of guilt, the fear of failure lifted just a little. Enough for me to see the man he used to be peeking through. Motherhood was not what I expected. I had read books, listened to women at church, watched my own mother with her quiet grace. But nothing prepares you for the way a baby rewrites every minute of your day, every inch of your body, every dream you once had. Sleep became a rare treasure. My hands were always full of bottles of blankets, of this tiny person who needed me in ways no one else ever had. And I loved it. I loved the exhaustion, the spit up, the cracked nipples, the lullabies hummed at 2 a.m. I even loved the tears, hers and mine. Because after everything we'd been through, those tears were signs of life, of healing. Lily was a gentle baby. She smiled early, laughed loudly, and had a way of curling her tiny fingers around my thumb that made me feel 10 feet tall. She adored Samuel. When he came home from work, she'd squeal and bounce and stretch out her arms until he swept her up. He called her my little light, and she was our light in a long dark tunnel. 2 years later, I found myself staring at another positive pregnancy test. This time I didn't cry. I just sat quietly, hand resting over my belly, and whispered, "Thank you." When we told Lily she was going to have a sibling, she clapped her hands like we'd given her the moon. "I want a baby sister," she declared, full of confidence. "Well," Samuel chuckled, "we'll see what the good Lord gives us." He gave us a boy. We named him Jonah. He came into the world with a full head of dark hair, and a scream that rivaled his sister's first cry. Where Lily had been gentle, Jonah was fierce. He kicked before he could crawl, climbed before he could walk, and asked why before he could finish full sentences. Raising 2 children was a new kind of hard. Lily was still a toddler when Jonah was born, and my days became a constant ballet of diapers, feedings, temper tantrums, and hurried dinners. But they were good days. Full days. I often said my heart was tired, not broken anymore. One afternoon, while folding laundry with a baby monitor crackling beside me, I heard Lily telling Jonah, "You're lucky, you know. Mama prayed you here." And I sat down right there on the floor and cried, not out of sadness but out of the deepest kind of awe. We had built a family. Not a perfect one, Lord knows we had our moments. Jonah once flushed Samuel's wedding ring down the toilet. Lily cut her bangs off the day before school pictures. Samuel lost his temper more than once, especially when money got tight again. And I had my own meltdowns, 2 days when I locked myself in the bathroom just to breathe. But we loved. And we tried. And we kept showing up for one another. That was the miracle. When people in town asked how we were doing, I'd smile and say, busy, blessed. Both at once. And I meant it. Samuel built Lily a treehouse when she turned 5. He let her hand him nails and measure things with a crooked ruler. Jonah, jealous of the attention, painted the side of our barn green with a broom dipped in leftover house paint. Instead of scolding, Samuel handed him a proper brush and said, "Might as well finish the job, son." That's the kind of father he became. Rough around the edges but steady in love. One night after the kids were asleep, Samuel and I sat on the porch watching the stars. He reached over and took my hand, thumb tracing the creases of my palm. "I used to think we were cursed," he said softly. "After we lost the first one, I thought maybe we weren't meant to have a family." I squeezed his hand back. "And now?" I asked. He looked toward the window, where the soft glow of a nightlight shone through the kids' room. "Now," he said, "I think we were just waiting for the right ones. That's the thing about life. It doesn't always unfold the way you planned. But sometimes if you're lucky, it gives you something even better than what you asked for." I had my babies. Not when I thought I would. Not how I imagined, but they came. And they taught me that joy can grow in the ruins, that love is louder than loss, and that healing doesn't always look like what we expect, but it always leaves something beautiful behind. Sometimes the scariest kind of silence is not the one filled with shouting or breaking plates. It's the silence that lingers after someone you love walks out the door and doesn't come back. That's what happened the spring Jonah turned 4. It was an ordinary Tuesday. I was making oatmeal pancakes because Lily had asked the night before, and Samuel liked to pour syrup in a perfect circle around his plate like it meant something. The kids were still in pajamas, sleepy-eyed and full of chatter. Samuel came into the kitchen wearing his old work jacket, kissed me lightly on the cheek, ruffled Jonah's curls and said, "Back by sundown, love." He never came back. The sun dipped low behind the hills, the pancakes long gone, bedtime stories read and reread, and still no Samuel. I called his work. They said he hadn't come in. I called the sheriff's office, half embarrassed, half horrified. They sent a patrol car out, said they'd keep an eye out. Could be car trouble, they said. Men get tired. Sometimes they just need to breathe. But Samuel wasn't the kind of man to disappear for air. I waited 2 days before I opened the top drawer of his nightstand. That's when I knew. The envelope was addressed to me. Inside was a short note in his square, careful handwriting. "Clara Jane, I love you and the children more than my own life. But I've made mistakes I can't fix. I've tried to protect you from it, but it's too big now. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Tell Lily and Jonah I love them forever. Samuel." There was no explanation. Just that single crushing sentence. I've made mistakes I can't fix. The sheriff came back the next morning. They found his truck abandoned near the riverbend. Keys still in the ignition. No signs of struggle.
No Samuel.
And just like that, he was gone. I wish I could say the hardest part was the not knowing. But it wasn't. The hardest part came 3 weeks later, when a man in a suit knocked on our door and handed me a notice. Unpaid debts. Several. One credit account after another. Loans I didn't know existed. The mill had downsized 6 months earlier, and Samuel had been out of work without telling me. To keep the family afloat, he'd borrowed from every corner of town. Banks, private lenders, even an old acquaintance from church who'd lent him over $5,000 in cash. He'd shielded me from all of it. I had no idea. The suit said the debts were in his name, but some were co-signed in mine. "You could file for bankruptcy," he offered, not unkindly. "But it won't be easy, especially with 2 children. It wasn't just money we'd lost. It was trust. It was security. It was the sense of being safe in the home you built together." Lily, only 6, asked every day, "When's Daddy coming home?" And every time I had to find a different way to say, "I don't know." Jonah didn't ask. He just grew quieter. He stopped playing with the toy train Samuel had carved for his 3rd birthday. He began having nightmares, crying out in the middle of the night, and clinging to me so tightly I thought I'd break. I was left with 2 small children, a broken mortgage, and a heart that couldn't figure out if it should grieve or rage. I chose both. Some days I cried in the laundry room, away from their eyes. Other days I pounded dough for bread like it was Samuel's chest. But every day I got up, packed Lily's lunch, made sure Jonah brushed his teeth, and tried to keep our home from falling apart. Neighbors helped. Quietly. Groceries left at the door. A hand-me-down coat for Jonah when winter came early. A free haircut for Lily from Miss Patty, who ran the beauty shop. I sold the old Ford. Then Samuel's tools. Eventually I picked up sewing again. Word spread that I could fix hems, take in suits, even make a decent dress from scratch. It didn't solve everything, but it was a beginning. And the truth? There were days I hated Samuel. Days I called him a coward under my breath while folding his socks. But then I'd open his letter again, worn at the corners from so many rereadings, and I'd feel the guilt and sadness in every stroke of that pen. He hadn't left because he stopped loving us. He'd left because he didn't know how to face what he'd done. That was almost harder to accept. It took me years, truly years, to forgive him. But I did. Not for him. For me. For Lily and Jonah. Because I couldn't let his absence define who we were going to be. One night as I tucked Jonah into bed, he whispered, "Mom, if Daddy loved us, why'd he leave?" I sat down beside him, brushing the hair from his forehead. Sometimes, I said slowly. People are hurting so bad inside. They think the only way to fix it is to disappear. Is that what he did? I nodded. Yes, baby. But it doesn't mean he stopped loving you. Some people just don't know how to stay when things get hard. But I placed my hand over his heart. We are staying. We're here. And we are going to be okay. And somehow we were. Because even when the people we love leave behind debt, heartbreak and silence, we have the power to build again, to choose forgiveness, to keep the lights on anyway. There are people who walk into your house carrying a suitcase, and somehow it feels like they brought a storm in with them. My brother Walter hadn't set foot in my life for over 10 years. Not since he packed his car after Mama's funeral and drove away without saying goodbye. We'd grown up like branches from the same tree, close, tangled, impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. But time, distance, and pride had a way of turning siblings into strangers. And now suddenly he was standing on my porch. It was a bitter November morning. I just put Jonah down for a nap, and Lily was stringing beads in the living room. When I opened the door and saw him there, coat too thin for the weather, suitcase in one hand, bottle of bourbon peeking from the other, I didn't speak. Neither did he. He just said, "Clara Jane." Like the name was something sacred, and his voice cracked right down the middle. "I heard about Samuel," he added, glancing down at the ground. And I figured, maybe now's a good time. A good time for what? I wasn't sure. I let him in. The kids stared. They didn't know him. Didn't even know I had a brother. I hadn't spoken of him in years. How do you explain a person who once knew every corner of your soul, but chose silence when you needed them most? That first night, he slept on the couch, arms folded across his chest like he was bracing for something. He didn't ask for anything. Didn't offer much either. Just sat quiet, eyes fixed on nothing. I learned he'd lost his job at the rail yard in Tucson. That he'd been living out of his truck for the past 2 months. That he hadn't touched bourbon in 3 weeks and was trying his best to stay clean. Trying. I made breakfast the next morning, biscuits, eggs, and black coffee the way Daddy used to like it. Walter didn't say much, just whispered thanks. And quietly helped clear the dishes afterward. Lily asked if he'd play checkers with her. He said yes. That's how it started. Little by little, he began to settle into the rhythm of our house. He'd take Jonah for walks in the afternoon, help me fix the leaky faucet in the kitchen, fold laundry without being asked. And still he felt like a ghost. Polite, quiet, careful. We danced around the past like it was broken glass on the floor, neither one of us willing to pick up the pieces. Until one Sunday evening, it was just the two of us on the porch. The kids were asleep, and I was finishing the last of my sewing orders by lamplight. Walter lit a cigarette and stared into the dark. "I should have come back sooner," he said. I didn't respond. I knew Samuel was struggling. I knew you had 2 kids. I read Mama's letters. I just didn't know how to be the kind of man you could count on. "That's not what I needed," I said, folding a hem with tired fingers. "I just needed my brother." He looked at me then, eyes heavy with regret. "I wasn't brave like you." I laughed, but it wasn't a joyful sound. Brave? I've cried into dishwater more nights than I can count. Bravery looks a lot like survival when you've got babies counting on you. He nodded slowly. "I see that now." That night was the first time we truly talked. Not just about Samuel or money or Mama's funeral, but about the spaces between us. The years we'd wasted. The anger we never named. The pain we both carried. And still I wasn't sure. Could trust be rebuilt? Could a man who walked away so easily ever be part of this home again? I watched him closely over the weeks that followed. He kept showing up. He helped Jonah build a birdhouse for the science fair. Taught Lily how to ride her bike. Took night shifts at the gas station down the road to help with groceries. Paid for firewood with his first paycheck. And he never touched the bourbon again. He slipped the bottle into my hands one night still full and said, "You hold it." I don't trust myself yet. Maybe that's when I started to trust him again. I mean, not because he was perfect, he wasn't. Not because he said the right words, he rarely did. But because he stayed. Day after day. Quietly. Humbly. Steadily. He stayed. And after so much leaving in my life, staying felt like a kind of miracle. One night, after the kids were asleep, he knocked softly on my bedroom door. "I've been saving up," he said. "I want to pay back some of what I cost you. I can't fix the past, but I can be better moving forward." I didn't take the money. I didn't need it. But I hugged him for the first time in a decade. And for the first time since Samuel disappeared, I didn't feel quite so alone in that house. Sometimes family leaves. Sometimes they come back. And sometimes the stranger who walks through your front door is the very person who reminds you what love looks like when it chooses to stay. There are moments in life that split you in two, before and after. I was 14 the first time my uncle's hand lingered too long on my back. It was a summer evening in 1967. The windows were open, letting in the scent of dry earth and the faint hum of crickets. My mama had gone to bed early, exhausted after a long day at the fabric shop. My brother Walter had taken Jonah and Lily out for ice cream, a rare treat on his night off. And I was alone in the kitchen with Uncle Leon. He wasn't really my uncle. He was Charles's older cousin, one of those men who appears at family gatherings, drinks too much, laughs too loud, and somehow always stays longer than he's welcome. He'd come to visit from Houston just for a few days, but by the third week it was clear he wasn't leaving. That night, he asked if I could help him find the sewing kit Mama kept in the drawer. "My shirt's missing a button," he said with a crooked smile. I should have known better. But I was raised to be polite, to help, to not make a fuss. I bent down to look in the drawer, and that's when I felt it. His hand suddenly on the back of my leg. Too high, too deliberate. I froze. "Such a pretty girl," he muttered. "Growing up so fast." I stood up fast and backed away, knocking over the chair behind me. He chuckled as if it were a joke. "What? Can't take a compliment." I didn't answer. I grabbed the kit, dropped it on the table and ran to my room, locking the door behind me. That night, I lay in bed trying to make sense of what happened. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe he didn't mean it that way. Maybe I was overreacting. That's the kind of lie we tell ourselves to sleep. But the next morning he cornered me in the hallway, put his hand on my waist, called me sweet girl with a tone that made my skin crawl. And I knew. This wasn't a mistake. It was a warning. Kept happening. Little things at first, passing by too close, brushing my arm too long. Then worse. One evening while everyone was out, he came into the living room where I was reading and sat too close. His knee touched mine. He reached for my hand. I jumped up and left the room, heart pounding, shame burning my cheeks like fire. Finally I told Mama. I waited until we were alone folding laundry. I didn't know how to say it. I just blurted, "Uncle Leon touched me." And not in a normal way. She stopped folding, stared at me. "What do you mean?" He keeps touching me, saying things. "It's not right, Mama." Her face turned to stone. Not anger. Not horror. Fear. "Clara Jane," she said, lowering her voice. "You can't say things like that about family." "But it's true. He's Charles's cousin. He's just being friendly. He lost his wife. He's lonely. Maybe you misunderstood." My voice cracked. "Mama, I didn't misunderstand." She sat down on the edge of the bed. "I'm sure you think something happened, but Leon is a guest in this house. We can't start trouble. Charles is already stressed. Please don't say anything else." I wanted to scream, but I didn't, because I saw it in her eyes. She was scared too. Of what people would say. Of losing the roof over our heads. Of being that family. So I stayed quiet. And he stayed. Another 2 weeks. 2 more weeks of avoiding hallways. Of sleeping with the door locked. Of pretending I didn't exist when he was around. I started failing math. Skipping meals. I didn't want to be in my own body. Didn't want to be in that house. I felt dirty. Crazy. Like I'd imagined the whole thing. Until the day Lily walked into the kitchen, pale and shaking. "Uncle Leon kissed me," she whispered. "I didn't want him to. I didn't wait for Mama's permission. Called Charles at work. I told him everything. Every touch. Every word. What happened to me. What just happened to Lily. And you know what he did? He came home. He told Leon to pack his things and never come back. He didn't raise his voice. Didn't hit him. Just stared him down and said, 'If you ever come near my girls again, they'll be burying you.' I've never seen Charles that cold before. He didn't say much to me afterward. just put his hand on my shoulder, gave it a firm squeeze and said, "You did the right thing." It took years before I could say that to myself. That I did the right thing. Even when no one believed me. Even when silence felt safer than truth. Even when shame told me to stay small. Lily and I never talked much about it again. But I saw it in her eyes. She knew I had protected her. And she never forgot it. Sometimes being believed is the beginning of healing. Sometimes being brave means speaking out. Even when your voice trembles. Even when you're not sure anyone will stand beside you. But sometimes, just sometimes, truth is stronger than silence. And a girl's voice, especially when she's not yet a woman, can break the chain before it reaches someone else. There's a kind of silence that falls over a house after someone leaves. Not the soft silence of peace, but the hollow kind. The kind that hums in the walls like a question left unanswered. I still remember the morning I found Eliza's letter. She had just turned 16 the week before. We'd baked a small cake, just her, me and Lily.
No candles, no guests.
She didn't want any fuss. Said she was tired. That was the first sign. She had grown quieter since Uncle Leon left. Not bitter, not angry, just far away. Like her body was still with us, but her spirit had packed up and moved long ago. That morning, the sun hadn't even crept over the hills yet. I was up early as always, preparing breakfast before school. I knocked on Eliza's door to wake her, but something felt off. The bed was made too perfectly. The air smelled faintly of lilacs and old tears. When I opened the door, I saw the letter. A folded envelope placed carefully on the pillow, addressed simply, "Aunt Clara." I knew. Before I even opened it, I knew. I sat on the edge of the bed and unfolded the paper with trembling hands. "Dear Aunt Clara, please don't be angry. I love you and Lily more than words can say, but I can't stay here anymore. Every hallway, every plate in the cupboard, every creak of the floor reminds me of what he did, and what no one stopped. I don't blame you. I know you tried to protect me in your own way, but I feel like I'm living in someone else's skin, and I can't breathe anymore. I need to find a place where I can feel whole again, where I'm not the broken girl, where no one looks at me with pity or shame or questions they're too scared to ask. I promise I'll be careful. I've saved some money from the sewing jobs and tutoring. I'm not running away forever. Just long enough to find myself again. Tell Lily I love her. Tell her she's stronger than she thinks. And thank you, for the nights you sat with me in silence, for the mornings you made tea and didn't ask questions. That meant more than you know. I'll write when I can. Love always. Eliza." By the end of the letter I was crying. Not loud sobs. Just silent, steady tears that fell onto the ink and blurred the last line. She was gone. I checked the closet. Half her clothes were missing. The red backpack too. She'd planned this. Carefully. Quietly. Lily found me sitting on Eliza's bed. The letter crumpled in my hand. "She left, didn't she?" she asked. I nodded. "Good," Lily whispered. Her voice was flat, but her eyes were full. "Maybe she'll find peace where this house couldn't give it." I didn't call the police. Some might say I should have. But I knew Eliza. She wasn't running out of rebellion. She wasn't chasing danger. She was running because staying had become a slow kind of death. And in her heart she was choosing life. I told Charles. He was quiet for a long time. Then he folded the letter and placed it in the top drawer of his desk. "I wish I'd done more," he said. I didn't answer. Because wishing had never changed anything. Days passed. Then weeks. I cooked dinner for 3 again. Set the table with 1 chair missing. And every night before bed, I looked out the window, hoping to see her walking down the path. But she never came. Instead she wrote. The first letter arrived a month later. Postmarked from Reno, Nevada. She had found a job at a bakery. Working early mornings frosting cupcakes and kneading dough. She was renting a small room above the shop. Said the owner was kind and let her read books from the library shelf in the back. She said she was okay. Said the nightmares still came sometimes, but they didn't own her anymore. I read that line over and over. They don't own me anymore. Eliza was never a fragile thing. She had iron in her bones and stars in her eyes, even after everything. But trauma makes you forget your own strength. Sometimes you need distance to remember. In her letters she never said she was coming back. And I never asked her to. Because home isn't always the place where you're born. Sometimes it's the place you have to build for yourself with your bare hands and broken heart. Years later, I would meet Eliza again. Older, wiser, with streaks of silver in her black hair and a child of her own in her arms. But that's a story for another day. What I want to tell you now, my dears, is this. Sometimes love means holding on. Sometimes love means letting go. And sometimes the bravest thing a girl can do is leave. I used to think the truth was something you whispered in the dark, something too heavy to carry in daylight. But I was wrong. Sometimes the truth is the very thing that sets you free. It was 10 years after Eliza left when I finally told my story out loud. Not in a whisper. Not in a letter. But to a room full of people who didn't know me, who owed me nothing, and who held their breath when I opened my mouth. It began with a flyer. A support group for adult survivors of childhood abuse had opened in Fresno, just an hour's drive away. Lily brought it home one day, quietly slipped it onto my sewing table while I was hemming one of her dresses. I stared at that little square of paper for days. I told myself it wasn't for me. I was too old, too far removed, too fine. But one Tuesday I put on my best blue blouse, tied my hair back and drove. It was a small room. Folding chairs. A pot of lukewarm coffee. No one wore name tags. There was no therapist in a white coat. Just people. People with tired eyes and gentle voices. And silence. So much silence. Until a woman in her 60s spoke first. She said her name was Margaret. She had been abused by her stepfather and told no one for 45 years. Not her husband. Not her children. She had swallowed it so deep that it lived in her bones. And now she was tired of carrying it. When she finished, there was no applause.
No gasps.
Just nods. And a single tissue passed quietly into her lap. Then the room turned to me. I don't remember exactly how I started. I think I said something like, "My name is Clara." And for a long time I thought silence was survival. Then I told them. I told them about Uncle Leon. I told them about how no one believed me. I told them about Eliza and the letter, and the empty chair that stayed at our kitchen table for years after she left. And when I finished, I cried. Not the quiet, controlled tears I was used to. I cried like a little girl who had waited too long to be held. And they let me. After the meeting, Margaret came over. She didn't say much. She just hugged me. And in that moment, something broke and healed inside me at the same time. I started going every Tuesday. For months. Each time I spoke, I felt a little lighter. A little more whole. I began to understand something no one had told me when I was young. Telling the truth doesn't make you weak. It makes you real. And when we're real, we give others permission to be real too. One night, Lily asked if she could come with me. She was grown by then, working part-time at the library and writing poems in her spare hours. She'd always been quiet about the past. But I think watching me open up had stirred something in her. At the meeting, she didn't say much at first. But then she read a poem. It was called "My Sister Didn't Run, She Flew." It was about Eliza. About me. About what silence steals from girls and what truth can give back. When she finished, the room was still. Then someone clapped. Then everyone. And Lily, my shy, soft-spoken Lily, smiled in a way I hadn't seen since she was 12. The poem ended up being published in a small anthology of survivor writings. Nothing fancy. Just a spiral-bound collection sold for $5 at local shelters and libraries. But it meant something. We were no longer just statistics. We were voices. Stories. Proof. Somewhere in all of this, I decided to write a letter to Eliza. I didn't have an address. But I remembered the bakery in Reno she'd mentioned all those years ago. I sent it there, hoping it might find its way. In the letter, I told her about the support group. About the poem. About how the kitchen chair was still hers if she ever wanted it. 3 months later, a postcard arrived. "Aunt Clara, I got your letter." I read it with shaking hands and a heart too full for words. "I don't know if I'm ready to come back, but I believe you now. I believe in you. And I believe in me too. Thank you for telling the truth. Love always, Eliza." I keep that card in my top drawer, next to her original letter. 2 chapters of the same long story. The story of a girl who ran to survive. And a woman who spoke to heal. So, my dears, if you've carried something heavy for too long, If your silence has grown roots inside your chest, please remember, it is never too late to tell your truth. Never too late to trade shame for freedom. Never too late to find your voice. Because even in the darkest night, redemption waits. And sometimes all it takes is one brave word. Some people say you only get one chance to be a mother. I say they haven't met Eliza. It had been nearly 12 years since she ran. 12 years of silence broken only by a few sparse letters, and that single postcard that I'd read until the ink wore thin. I never stopped hoping, but I also stopped expecting. And then, on a rainy afternoon in early spring, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I was in the kitchen dusting flour off my hands, halfway through kneading dough for a small batch of cinnamon rolls. Lily was upstairs, working on a piece for her community poetry group. The house was quiet, our kind of quiet. When I opened the door, I saw a woman standing there. A woman with tired eyes, hair tied back in a simple braid, and a worn canvas bag slung over one shoulder. And in her arms, a little girl no more than 5, with honey brown curls and a pink backpack that looked almost too big for her tiny frame. "Hi," the woman said.
I'm Elisa.
I didn't say a word. Not for a full breath. Then I stepped forward and pulled her into my arms. Her shoulders trembled. The child, her daughter, tightened her grip around her mother's neck but didn't cry. I invited them inside without asking questions. Because when someone you love finally comes home, you don't lead with questions. You lead with warmth. That night after dinner, after Lily came downstairs and cried quietly in the hallway, after the little girl, her name was Mabel, fell asleep curled between a stuffed elephant and a patchwork quilt, I sat with Eliza in the kitchen. The same kitchen where I had once read her goodbye letter. Now we sat again, facing each other, like two women with too many years between them and too much silence to ignore. "I didn't know where else to go," she said quietly. "You came home," I said. "That's all that matters." Eliza told me bits and pieces. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. About how she had built a life, slowly and alone with no roadmap. How she had worked nights waitressing while finishing her GED. How she had gone to community college, then worked at a non-profit shelter for girls. How Mabel was born from a brief relationship that didn't last, but gave her a reason to wake up every day and try harder. "She saved me," she said, glancing toward the stairs. I smiled. "And now you're saving her." We didn't use the word mother that night. But in the days that followed, something beautiful happened. We became one. Not because of blood, or because we tried to recreate what we'd lost, but because we learned to build something new. In the mornings I made pancakes for Mabel and let her pick the shape hearts, stars, once even a wonky-looking dinosaur. She giggled when I burnt one and asked for a crunchy one again the next day. Eliza started helping at the library with Lily. First just shelving books, then leading small reading groups for young girls. "I think I forgot how much I love this," she said one afternoon. Her hands were ink-smudged from stamping dates into borrowed books. Her eyes brighter than I'd seen them since she was a teen. At night, we'd sit together in the living room, sometimes talking, sometimes just being. She asked me once while folding laundry, "Do you think I'm a good mother?" I looked at her. "I think you're the kind of mother Mabel will grow up proud of." That made her cry. But it was the good kind of cry. The kind that rinses something old and leaves room for new roots. We talked about what healing really meant. Not forgetting. Not pretending it didn't happen. But reclaiming the power it tried to take from you. One Sunday morning as we cleaned out the garage, Eliza found an old box. Inside it, the beginnings of the quilt I'd started for her when she was just 13. A tangle of fabric squares and half-finished patterns. Colors that no longer matched, edges frayed with time. "You never finished it," she said gently. "I never got the chance," I replied. We looked at each other. And we both knew. We'd finish it together. So we did. Every Friday night after Mabel went to bed, we sat at the dining room table, needle and thread in hand. Some nights we barely said a word. Others we spoke more than we had in a decade. We stitched stories into that quilt. Forgiveness. Laughter. Old scars and new beginnings. By the time the quilt was finished, spring had turned into summer, and Eliza had found a part-time job at the shelter downtown. She was staying. Not just in the house. In her life. And in mine. So my dears, if you've ever thought it was too late to mend something torn, let me tell you this. Some fabric may be fragile, but when stitched with love, even the most broken quilt can become the warmest one. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when Mabel asked the question. She was 12 then. Not quite a child, not yet a woman. Just in that soft, uncertain in-between, where curiosity blooms like wildflowers after rain. We were sitting on the porch. I was shelling peas for dinner, and she was sketching something in her little spiral notebook, tongue pressed to the corner of her mouth, as she always did when concentrating. "Grandma Clara," she said without looking up, "why don't you ever talk about when you were young?" The question came gently. There was no accusation in it.
No suspicion.
Just wonder. The kind only a child who's learning how big the world is, and how small her piece of it has been. I paused. The bowl of peas in my lap suddenly felt heavier. I looked at her, my Mabel. Eliza's daughter. The granddaughter I never expected to have, who had brought so much light back into the corners of my life that I thought would stay dark forever. And I knew the time had come. Not for the whole story. Not all at once. But for the truth. Because she deserved that. Because I deserved that. "Do you really want to know, sweetheart?" I asked. She looked up at me, green eyes wide and steady. "Yes. But only if you want to tell me." That's when I put the bowl down. "Well then," I said, folding my hands in my lap, "let me tell you a little something about silence." And I began. I told her that when I was younger than she was, I had dreams of having a big family. That I had prayed for a sibling like other girls prayed for ponies or dolls. That when my little brother finally came, well, he never got the chance to live. And neither did the version of me that believed families couldn't break. I didn't give her the details of that night in Bakersfield. Not yet. But I told her about the pain of losing someone you never got to meet. The weight of feeling invisible. The ache of carrying a truth that no one around you could, or would hear. She listened quietly, pencil now forgotten, her notebook resting on her knees. I told her that sometimes people who are supposed to protect us fail. And sometimes the people who hurt us are the very ones who are supposed to love us. Her brows furrowed. Like a grown-up hurting a kid? I nodded slowly. Yes. Just like that. She didn't ask who. She didn't have to. Children sense more than we think. Her silence said she understood enough. But, I added, do you know what's even more powerful than pain? She tilted her head. What? Truth. And love. And the choice to start again. Even when the world has told you it's too late. I told her about Eliza. About the day she ran. About how we both lived in silence for years before we found our way back. I told her about the quilt we finished together. And how each stitch was like sealing a wound that had stayed open for too long. She was quiet for a long while. Then she said something I'll never forget. I think it's really brave that you told me. And just like that, I felt something shift. I had spent so much of my life believing that sharing the truth would burden others. That I had to protect the next generation from the weight of my story. But maybe, just maybe, telling it was the real protection. Because now Mabel knew she could ask. She knew she could speak. And most of all, she knew that pain wasn't something to be hidden in the attic of the heart. It was something to be named. To be held. To be transformed. Later that week, she asked if she could write about it for a school project. Not everything, she clarified. Just what you've taught me. About resilience. I gave her my blessing. She titled the essay, "The Strongest Woman I Know." It started with the line, "My grandmother doesn't wear armor, but she taught me what courage looks like." And that, my dears, is how legacy works. Not in wealth. Not in fame. But in truth shared at the right moment to the right heart. So if someone young ever asks you why, don't run from the answer. You never know what kind of strength your honesty might unlock. Because sometimes the truth that once shattered us becomes the very thing that saves someone else. If you're still with me, my dear, after all these chapters, I want to thank you. Truly. From this old wooden rocking chair by my front window, sunlight warming my knees, a half-knitted scarf resting in my lap, I want to tell you something I've never spoken aloud to anyone outside my family. Why now? Why, at 78 years old, with silver in my hair and memories as thick as molasses, I finally decided to speak my truth. It wasn't easy. For years, I told myself that silence was strength. That holding things in was the noble thing to do. that the past belonged to yesterday, and nothing good would come from digging it up. But as I watched my granddaughter Mabel grow, as I saw Eliza blossom again into the fierce, whole woman she was always meant to be, as I sat by the bedside of dear friends fading into memory, I began to feel something stirring inside me. Not guilt, not fear, but urgency. The sense that there were stories inside me that weren't just mine. They belong to others now, to you even, because what we survive doesn't just shape us. Teaches. It connects. It heals. And what good is a life full of pain and wisdom if it ends with no one hearing the full melody of it? You see, this rocking chair I sit in, it's not just furniture. It's where I cried for the first time after Eliza ran away. It's where I waited for news from the hospital after my mother's stroke. It's where I nursed Mabel to sleep when Eliza worked late into the night. It has held generations of tears, laughter, and late-night prayers. It's also where I started recording these words. Just a phone on a little tripod, a script scribbled in pencil, a warm cup of tea beside me. I didn't know if anyone would listen. I just knew I couldn't leave this world having never told the truth. Not just the pain, but the strength, the rebuilding, the second chances that came long after I thought they were possible. Because here's what I've learned after all these years. Pain will try to make you small. It'll whisper that your voice doesn't matter, that your story is too messy, that people will turn away. But healing makes you brave. And even if your voice shakes, speak anyway. Even if the first person doesn't believe you, keep speaking. Even if it takes 50 years to find the words, say them when you can. I sat in silence for decades, but not anymore. And if my story, the story of a girl from a blue house in Bakersfield, who ran barefoot into the night with nothing but hope and a breaking heart, if that story helped even one of you feel seen, then this was worth every moment. Now, before I end this tale, I want to leave you with this. You don't need to wait until you're 78 to tell your story. You don't need permission. You don't need perfect words. All you need is the courage to begin. And if you don't know where to start here, in the comments. Tell me your name. Tell me where you're listening from. Tell me one person who helped you hold on when things got hard. And if you've made it all the way through my story, please, my dear, leave a like. Subscribe to this little channel of mine. There are more stories to come, mine, yours, ours. Because healing isn't a straight road. It's a quilt made from many hands, many voices, and many truths. And together, we can stitch something beautiful. So until next time, this is Grandma Clara in her rocking chair, sending love from my little front porch to you. May you find peace. May you find voice. And may you always know you are never alone.